We're back for another round of Unilateral Decisions. Thank you so much for joining us. Unilateral Decisions delves into the how and the why we got where we are today in this ever-changing landscape of college athletics and name, image, likeness. So today we're talking about a recent case that's making a huge impact. Ohio et al. Versus the NCAA from December 2023, where 10 states and the Department of Justice sued the NCAA, drastically changing the landscape when it comes to student-athletes transferring. Our duo of former college athletics administrators Nickell and Mike Walsh talk with sports legal expert and college professor Sam Ehrlich to discuss how we got here and what it's looked like ever since.
All right, everyone. Appreciate you joining us once again on Unilateral Decisions. And some feedback we've heard in the early episodes, and I understand this, is that it's a very dense subject matter for everything. I know I'm not smart enough to understand it. Some viewers have said they don't feel they're smart enough to understand it. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, Joe, I'm looking at you to dumb this down for us. Tell me about Ohio et al. Versus NCAA. At the heart of it, your 10 to 15 second pitch. What is this court case?
So you want me to, before they go
Absolutely.
Up here, come down here?
Bring it down with the commoners like me.
The NCAA, let's back up. Institutions spend a lot of money recruiting and retaining student athletes. And this has been the case for decades. This is not like a new thing in college athletics. Schools spend a lot of money to recruit athletes to their campuses. And when they sign with that institution, they want to ensure that they stay with that institution. So over the course of time, all of the rules and regulations around transfer rules were designed to keep kids where they were. And over the course of time, every single case that came through gradually stripped away that ability to keep a kid on campus. And here we are today with the transfer portal and everything surrounding that. I know everybody loves it. That is the layman's explanation of this case.
For those that weren't familiar with how student athletes could move within the college athletics world, what was transferring like prior to this, and what were some of those restrictions or ways that student athletes had to deal with some consequences when they did transfer from a school?
Yeah, so this goes way back. The consideration of transferring goes way, way back in NCAA history. And I think just to add one point to what Joe said was that there's also the component from a law standpoint about, is the value exchange enough is what the athlete is getting in exchange or the student is getting in exchange enough for the school to take those measures that you referred to about trying to protect their investment. And that's really what Sam will probably dive into more. But from a historical context of transferring, it started, the first really rules around it were early 1900s out of the Ivy League about in-conference, intra-conference transferring, and they all kind of self-regulated and said, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to sit out a year if you do that. By the 1960s, that was adopted really NCAA-wide, was this year in residence rule, which we'll talk more about, which says if you transfer institutions to play a sport, you have to sit out a year. You have to be a year in residence at that institution before you can compete for your new school. And a lot of reasons for that, a lot of, justifications. Joe hit it on the head, I think, of the underlying reasons. But academic progress and just like collegiality in general, I think were reasons that the NCAA was trying to uphold. I think it was a novel concept, and I think it made a ton of sense. As we talked about in previous episodes, you fast forward on the commercialization of everything. Really, over time, there were a lot of one-time transfer exemptions through most of the sports. By the 2000s, there were really only 5 sports, football, the basketballs, baseball, men's hockey, where that one-time transfer exemption didn't exist. And then through the 2010s, you had really favorable waiver instances and examples where, everyone had a hardship, and all these hardships were taken very seriously. And so there wasn't a whole lot of basis for this year in residence to exist anymore, this punitive measure. And then 2018, they're really considering completely doing away with that. They made some changes to the transfer rules. This is where the portal actually came into existence, was 2018, which I think is important to remember. It's not that the portal starting is what started all of this kind of chaos that people see. It's really the lack of regulation anymore, and a lot of these rules being struck down by cases like Ohio. The portal was instituted because 2018 was really the first time that schools could no longer dictate where an athlete could transfer to. And so that rule eroded away, where, the athlete didn't have to get permission about the next school they were going to go to. And so once that went away, you started to see more changes. And then what really ramped up the intensity of change was the pandemic. And you had all these schools where people are sitting out, and yet their team can't even field a roster because of testing and, illness and all the other things. And so they just started issuing blanket waivers. And once those blanket waivers went out, really the future was kind of foretold, and you knew where this was going to go. And then they eliminated the restriction on the one-time transfer. They still had a restriction on multi-time transfers, which is where we kind of step into current day with Ohio and everything. But that's really the big picture, is that they were trying to limit the transfers from the very early days, limit the transfers because of academic progress, because there's this, sense of collegiality and needing to be a part of your community. And, much the same as I think a lot of people, when you leave high school, just as a general student, and you become a freshman at a university, a lot of places have a rule in place that you need to live on campus, or you have to have a pretty good extenuating circumstance not to, because of, onboarding and adaptation and getting used to this new way of life. And I think some of those same theories were part of the rulemaking around that. But as the commercialization came along, I think there were some other realities that came into place. And so all that stuff had to be reconsidered. And then Alston made it so that even more things could be reconsidered.
Tell me about Ohio State. What are they arguing in this, and what was the basis of what they were trying to accomplish from day one?
Yeah, and what's really interesting about this is it's not Ohio State University. It's actually the Ohio State Attorney General Office and several other Attorney General offices as well, including eventually the Department of Justice would add on to the suit along with other states as well, even after the TRO was originally granted, that, and really kind of bolstering kind of the opposition to this. And it was all about this, the multi-time transfer rule, and kind of going beyond this one-time transfer rule and going beyond the year in residence rule. Because you had, around this time, and, I hit on that, with the pandemic, you had these blanket waivers. And then all of a sudden in 2023, the NCAA really kind of pares back a lot of that, a lot of those blanket waivers. They pare back a lot of that kind of deference, and they really start to try to restrict transfers again. And it's clear why they were doing it. I mean, 2023 is really when we started to see, the NIL market really start to hit as much more of a pay for play kind of thing. And you had a lot of people complaining and a lot of people arguing that, well, the transfer, the freeness of transfers plus NIL was creating kind of this yearly free agency thing, which of course is what we see today. So the NCAA tried to cut that back. They tried to go back to a much harsher restriction that they had before. And there are a few cases that actually came up in this Ohio decision that Judge Bailey would eventually issue that really kind of stood out. Noah Fenske, for example, was a center at Colorado. He had originally played at Iowa, and he wanted to transfer to, I think it was Illinois State. And the NCAA said, you can't. And he said, well, I just got kicked off the team because I was at Colorado, and, Coach Prime came in and said that he's bringing all these bags, and, it's Gucci and you're not part of this. So he wasn't going to be able to play at Colorado. He tried to play at the second school, and the NCAA said no. And you had other situations like this. In fact, and it's important to kind of remember, like, the Ohio case actually wasn't the first kind of attack on this, even in 2023. Raekwon Battle was a basketball player who wanted to play at West Virginia. He filed the original lawsuit here, eventually kind of got consolidated in with the Ohio case. And he was saying, my coach left and I want to not even follow him. I want to go to West Virginia. West Virginia's willing to take a chance on me. And, coming from Montana State, and the NCAA said no. And there are a lot of these other examples that Judge Bailey picked on, that a lot of stakeholders picked on, and that led to the Attorney General getting involved here. And their theory was that, kind of similar to what you think about with non-compete clauses. Non-compete clauses where you have a contractual clause, or you have, even kind of just broader policy that says if you leave this job, you have to sit out a certain period of time before you can take another job with a competitor. They argued that this is essentially kind of the same thing, that it penalizes players for wanting to transfer. It depresses their value in the market. It does all these different things that really just violate antitrust law. And Judge Bailey, as we clearly saw, definitely kind of resonated with that argument.
Well, I did think, because reading through the legal filing, I thought it was hilarious, because what they pointed to in the legal filing is that NCAA schools had previously had a no poaching agreement amongst horizontal competition. And I found that comical, because every single case of transferring has always been about poaching. And those are all of the arguments being made to put all these rules in place. But anyway, I just thought it was funny.
Yeah, I mean, but I think the problem with it is it's so broad, and you can have. Well, I was going to say you could have kind of no poaching clauses, but you really can't. I mean, Ohio case kind of shows that. But I also think with Judge Bailey in particular, like he specifically cited the Fensky case, where it's like it wasn't that he was poached; he was actually going down from Colorado to Southern Illinois, and because his coach, his new coach came in and said, "You're not able to play here anymore. You don't have a spot on this team anymore. We're bringing a bunch of transfers to take your spot." And you see a lot. We hear a lot about kind of the the transient nature of the transfer portal, but I think it's important to remember that, and Judge Bailey clearly picked up on this as well, that not all players who are transferring because they want to kind of upgrade or they want money. Some of them are legitimately getting kicked off their team.
Yeah, let's get into that. If you're looking at the portal today, it seems from a 10,000-foot view as a net negative to me for a lot of reasons, but I don't know that I believe it is. So if you're a student athlete, what are the reasons you would get into the portal and you would look to find a second, third, fourth, maybe sometimes fifth college destination? Why are kids jumping into the portal? Because it's not just money, right?
It's a lot. I mean, it's playing time. Like Sam brought up, a lot of these court cases, these kids had situations, lost a spot, want to get closer to family, something happened. Every story is going to be different. You said besides money, I think that's a lot of it right now. That hasn't been an option before. But it's playing time. It's everything. It's legitimately everything.
And let's not just brush away the money as well, because college sports is a business. And for a while, we've wanted to say that it's not a business involving the athletes, that it's now there's, it's been this amateurism enterprise. But Alston clearly changed that. In fact, it's kind of funny to think back, because, you mentioned 2018. There's also something that happened with the transfer portal or with transfer restrictions in 2018. The Seventh Circuit decided Deppie v. NCAA, which was another lawsuit involving transfers, where a punter filed a lawsuit saying that the transfer restriction violates antitrust law, which sounds pretty familiar. Seventh Circuit said no. This is something that is pro-competitive. It has its pro-competitive presumption based on the Board of Regents language that we've talked about, and said that the transfer portal the transfer restrictions were in fact legal. Alston is right in the middle of that. Alston clearly changed the game, and the continued commercialization of college sports, both from not only with the athlete's perspective, but everything going around college sports, not only leads to the Alston decision, but also leads to the Ohio decision, where Judge Bailey says, well, we're not going to just look at it from a pro-competitive presumption anymore. We're not going to assume that things like amateurism and wanting to protect or wanting to ensure that athletes are able to continue their academic paths. We're not going to assume that these are validly pro-competitive. In fact, he rejected the idea that the transfer restrictions kind of serve those goals. He was saying there are other ways of doing this. You have the GPA rule, you have all these other, academic progress rules that accomplish this without being overbearing. And the transfer rule itself, he said, is overbearing.
You've already touched on a little bit, but a lot of this is, to me, non-compete. And I signed a non-compete at a job a long time ago. I didn't make enough money to hire a lawyer to challenge it if I wanted to. So I was in a spot where if I wanted to leave, I had to pay a dollar amount that I didn't have in my bank account, or I could only go to specific markets. And now we acknowledge players are getting paid. That's a big reason why people are leaving schools and going elsewhere. Now that we're considering it more of a business, do non-competes become more of a legal backing for these schools to, quote, protect their investments? And is that morally reprehensible or solid?
Well, I'll note real quick that under the Biden administration, the Federal Trade Commission actually issued a final rule saying that in their belief, non-compete clauses are violating antitrust law. So even just having a non-compete clause in one contract may not insulate them. And in fact, there are a lot of states that really hamper non-compete clauses. California doesn't even recognize them at all. California, in fact, there's case law in college sports. Todd McNair that actually suggests that California refuses to enforce out-of-state non-compete clauses. So I guess if you want to get around these non-compete clauses, just transfer to Stanford or Cal or UCLA.
Yeah, I think that your question goes a little bit deeper than in the current environment where non-competes are legally defensible as of today, despite what the FTC has said. It's a way. It's an option. Moral high grounds. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're going to lose a lot of that debate by leaning on non-competes as the reason that you want to do that. I think we can get into that a little later when we talk the current contracts now that everybody's under. I think we'll probably have an episode on the House settlement in general and what that has led to with these revenue share contracts that have really opened the door to different language that schools can use. But I think that the non-compete is the analogy here, is the parallel to draw. And it's, without diving too deep into non-competes in general, I think that it was made very clear in the Ohio ruling that this is the way that they were, putting these restrictions in place was not acceptable because Alston made it to where that amateurism wasn't just accepted as a reason for pro-competitive, justification. And so here we are trying to figure out, I think we've said before, and it gets said a lot, putting the toothpaste back in the tube. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen at this point. And so how do you make the best of it while understanding that the courts are going to continue to rule in this certain way that says you just cannot put these restrictions? And so how do you figure it out? I think that's what kind of leads to House. And I think we have more conversation there. But I think that going back to this Ohio time, I think, you saw, probably because there had been a ruling in 2018 that said to the NCAA that, signaled to them that they had grounds to fight this. But they really fought this one, even just publicly. Like, you go to 2023, December 2023, and we're in the middle of winter sports, and there's this temporary restraining order that's put in place based on the filing that says you can't, like, these guys are all capable of, participating. If you got somebody who has transferred multiple times, who's sitting on your bench, who's sitting out because of NCAA rules, they can play. And the NCAA just said, you might lose eligibility though. Like, yeah, court said you can play, but you might lose eligibility. So you've got these teams that are in the middle of playing their seasons who have, difference makers on the bench, both men's and women's basketball, highly ranked transfers who can't play. Now the court says they can, but the NCAA says they're taking a chance on their future eligibility. And frankly, it was one of those things that they drew this really hard line in the sand. The outcome felt inevitable, frankly. I was still at the university at this point. I was still working at Boise State. And this was one of those things for me that in order to have this conversation about where change could go for college athletics and how you could look at the future of college athletics, it became very hard for me to have that conversation and be outspoken about where I thought these things could go while still being in the system, because the NCAA is sitting here being pretty retaliatory toward athletes who are kind of caught in the middle of, here's this court ruling, here's what the NCAA rule is. Your schools don't really know which decision to make. You've got athletes who are saying, well, I want to have I don't want to lose a year of eligibility over 2 games if that's what this turns out to be. The coaches want them to play. I mean, they're all very stuck in the middle, and yet the NCAA is taking this really hard line on something that the writing was on the wall about where this was going. I mean, if you read the Alston decision for 2 minutes, you know where this decision's going. And so for me, that on a very personal level, that was one of the things that I kind of just said, one of the last straws. And, 3 months later, I had left college athletics, and I felt like that was almost a necessary move to be able to have the conversations and be part of the action that was going to create change and move toward the future of college athletics. There's been some shift internally now, I think, but that was really, for me, the NCAA is going to fight this. How do you be, an upstanding employee of a member institution and be able to be outspoken about the things that could change when they're fighting it in this fashion, even against their own athletes. And so it really did kind of shift some of the narrative for me. Obviously the ruling came and we know what that was, but it felt like, again, inevitable that that's what the ruling was going to be. And so instead of fighting, I just, I don't know, it really, this time in this case and the transfers and the athletes being the ones who were put in the middle in the hard spot, really did kind of irk me a little bit differently, I think.
Well, you said it. I mean, the outcome was inevitable, but I think so was the fallout. Like, everybody knew what was going to happen if the NCAA lost that case. And I'm not saying they were right. Like, I'm incredibly pro student athlete, but we knew if that case went the way it did, we were going to be looking at modern day transfer.
Free agency.
Like, that's exactly. So I think that's why the NCAA had to have so much pressure on it from every single angle of, institution, conference. Like, we have to win this case in order to, put some of that toothpaste back in the tube. Yeah. Otherwise, we're going to be here. And that's exactly what happened.
And how is that shook out nationally, where it is essentially free agency for not for every sport, but for many sports? How does that change the way coaches approach recruiting? How does it change the way athletes look at a season of hardship where they didn't play as much? I mean, how fundamentally different are the makeups of these college programs today than they were even 5-6 years ago?
Well, I mean, now you're signing contracts, instead of your NLI, like, you're signing contracts with a dollar value on it. And you're seeing schools now starting to put some parameters around it. And I think there was some hesitancy. Nobody wants to be first. There was hesitancy from the institutional side of things to put, parameters and, different things in contracts that they thought might impact them negatively in recruiting. You saw Georgia, what happened there. I mean, you're starting to see things be put into contracts that is giving, some protection to the schools. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. Sam probably knows way more about these contracts that are coming than I could ever even start to think about. But once somebody does something and it becomes acceptable, everybody follows suit. So as soon as somebody finds a way to put a contract together that makes sense on both sides of things, and people are like, yeah, that makes sense for everybody involved, I think you'll see everybody start to follow suit and do the exact same thing.
I think some of it too comes from the athletes are like, some of the solution was just money, right? And you throw money at the problem and you hope the money fixes the problem. And at the end of the day, there's going to be these conversations that, like, you don't just to get to throw money out and then that means you get to write whatever terms in the contract you want. I totally agree that the schools should be taking some of the leverage back. I think they lost all of it for a long time and they still have a lot of it. Mm-hmm. Like, we've talked about it before, the structure of the NCAA that they play under, the logo of the school on the helmet or whatever, the
value of a contract, like a kid going out and signing his own NIL deal and you don't have logo rights.
Sure.
As soon as there's logo rights involved in that contract, the value of that contract goes up exponentially.
Yeah. So the schools are in a position, I think, to start taking that leverage back. We've seen some of it. You mentioned some of the examples. But it's still that same, like, well, we'll just give them more money. We'll just give them more money. At some point, the athletes want to be involved in the conversation and maybe more so the athlete's representation or the athlete's parents or whatever. But, like, you don't get to just say, well, I put a bigger number on the contract, so now I get to tell you what you can and can't do more so. And that argument works a little bit. Like, we've all been in that situation, right? Like, yeah, you sign a contract. If there's more money on it, you're willing to take lesser terms. But at the end of the day, the schools are just kind of like throwing darts right now. And there's no framework. There's no guide. There's no anything. And the athletes still aren't really being considered and consulted on what should this look like. It gets back into kind of our collective bargaining conversation and true negotiation. But it's like, oh, well, yeah, we'll give you more money. And also, like, we still do some of this health insurance stuff and we still do some of these things. And it's like, well, is that what the athlete's asking for? Is that what, as a class, as a group, that the athletes would ask for? Or is freedom of movement more important for them when it comes to being able to transfer? Or are there some academic guidelines and regulations? Or is it, there's a lot of things that I don't think the questions have really been asked of the right group of people to say, this is what should be in the contract. It's going to take a lot of time. This does not get solved overnight. But I think that the more steps that the NCAA takes to just, or not even the NCAA, the schools take in conferences, putting a contract language in front of somebody and expecting them to just sign it, and then expecting them to live by it, we're going to keep ending up in court. And that's what's happening.
Yeah, and I'm glad you just corrected yourself in saying it's not the NCAA, it's the schools themselves, because we've seen, the restrictions on transferring a couple of times in the past few months, which is Damon Williams saying he's going to transfer and then coming back because he gets threatened with a lawsuit, and then Darian Mensah, who does transfer, but after he gets sued by Duke, and he or probably Miami paying a big buyout to Duke to allow him to transfer. Those are the restrictions on transferring that we have now. That's what it is, and that really is how it ought to work under antitrust law. I mean, unless you have a collective bargaining agreement, unless you have the protection of the non-statutory labor exemption, we were talking about non-competes. It's important to remember, as we talked about, non-compete clauses, generally speaking, in individual contracts are perfectly enforceable in 49 out of 50 states. What is not enforceable is blanket non-compete clauses that affect the entire industry. I mean, we not only saw this in a case that for a really good example that was cited in the Ohio case, I don't remember exactly how to pronounce it, but it was a case involving McDonald's, where in the McDonald's franchise agreement where McDonald's forced all their franchisees to sign contained no poach clause, where individual stores can't poach employees from other stores. And the Seventh Circuit said, no, this is blatantly illegal under antitrust law. It's a restriction of movement. It's something that you can't do. Even though the individual stores could probably enforce these, you can't have one that affects the entire kind of space. It's the contracts, combinations, and conspiracies that really kind of impact this. And yeah, that gets into kind of like the individual school governance, what the individual schools have the stomach to do, what they have the stomach to try to enforce. And I don't know, maybe we're going to see a lot more situations like Damon Williams and Darian Mensah and Damon Wilson coming through the pike, since their schools are not going to be the first anymore. But that's really the only way, barring congressional intervention or a collective bargaining agreement, for these any kind of transfer restrictions to be enforced.
Now, I realize that I'm 37 going on 75 with a lot of my life views, but traditionally, I look at head coaches at public institutions, football, men's basketball. They're oftentimes the most highly paid state employees. It's hard for me to feel bad for these head coaches. That being said, with this new transfer portal, the concept of a developmental program is kind of out the window, because you look at someone like Leighton Vander Esch at Boise State, small town kid, a star at that level, comes to Boise State, doesn't do much on the field for the first several years, but sticks it out because there's really not a better option. Goes on to be a first-round talent. How does this shift how coaches have to recruit? When you're not recruiting for this kid won't do anything for me for 2 years, but year 3 and 4, they're going to be a star. But now it's like you almost have to have a star from day one for you to want to invest in them, because you might only get 1 year with everybody.
I don't look at this through the lens of a coach. Like I look at this through the lens of, the fan bases and the people that are there supporting the programs. It's hard if you fall in love with somebody, and fandom is crazy. I get it, but it's hard watching somebody, feeling like that guy is part of your team. And then, you see it in the offseason. The guy gives his kid a jersey for Christmas, and then 2 weeks later, the guy transfers. Like, that's hard. Like, as a dad, as, a fan, you can talk about coaches and not feeling bad for coaches. And I'm not going to argue with you, but I do feel bad for the fan base. And that's where I think some of these contracts are going to start to come into play. Like, when you're signing, initially with an institution, like I could be way off base here, but I believe we'll probably get to a point where you're signing, everybody's signing multi-year deals, and there's going to be buyout clauses, and there's going to be other metrics that are involved, or mechanisms involved in these contracts that will allow you to transfer. The coaches don't get to say where you get to transfer anymore. But that's going to be in those contracts to give somebody that opportunity. And And hopefully when that kind of permeates all of college athletics, we can get a little bit more continuity and consistency amongst rosters from year to year. And that way that dad that goes out and buys that jersey for his kid isn't turning around 2 weeks later wondering, why he spent, $75.
Yeah, I think that you can just, again, you look to pro sports, they've got models, they've got things figured out. There's reasons that rookie contracts are certain lengths because you don't want, the small market team to end up with the first pick in the draft and they draft a superstar, and a year later, the big market team who didn't have to lose games and go through the misery to draft them can just come grab them. I think that there's reasons for that. Obviously, those are negotiated. And then I think also there's the NBA especially has these in place with the veteran max deals and the way that like the bird rights, and the team that the player currently plays on can pay them more in a lot of cases than, restricted free agency or unrestricted free agency. And so there is that like incentive to stay and to build that stardom and build the fan culture of that. And you also have veteran max deals, and it kind of builds in the roster construction where you can only have so many high dollar veterans, and you're going to have veterans who want to go somewhere else. But also if somebody's been with you on multiple contracts, you can pay them more than the other person can. And that's, again, I go back to my previous statement. It's going to take a lot of time. This is not going to happen overnight, but there are a lot of examples out there of ways that some of those things are considered already and solved for. If we can just get over the hump of like, there's a different way to approach some of these things that can be bargained, that can be negotiated, that we can all talk about together, that can be good for everybody, so long as both sides agree. And there's models out there that exist for some of the reasons that you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm looking ahead to announcing signing classes, and here's your 15 guys. Here's where they're from. Here's their position. Here's the length of the contract that they signed. Like I legitimately believe that's probably coming.
Could be, yeah.
Before we get into our unilateral decision of the day, anything on this case, Ohio, that we did not touch on that you think needs to be mentioned?
I think one thing that needs to be mentioned is that we're seeing echoes of this Ohio case today, and that's not even to say that the stuff about the transfer. I mean, obviously, the impact of Ohio on the transfer portal cannot be understated, and that we now have unlimited transfers because of the Ohio case. But looking at the eligibility cases, so much of the same reasoning, and you mentioned does this change how we look at hardship waivers? Absolutely, because so much of the same reasoning that came into play in Ohio comes into play in these eligibility cases as well. Because Judge Bailey had a passage that gets cited in all of these cases talking about how it only takes one shot or one pass or all the it only takes one moment playing in a game, aside from being in practice, being able to maybe sit out but still be able to practice. It only takes that one moment for a player to become a superstar. And that's what these players are arguing now, trying to get extra years as well. It's not even just about the money. It's also about, this is going to impact my draft stock, or even just the NCAA is not, they're arbitrarily kind of treating my hardship waiver. I just saw a case filed this week where, the player said, I have to file a lawsuit because the NCAA told me informally that your hardship waiver is getting rejected, but they haven't given a formal notice, so he can't appeal it. So he's going to court and saying, court, please handle this for me. And again, the same reasoning is applying to these cases. Judge Bailey himself decided in favor of four West Virginia football players, and kind of another similar opinion. Ohio led to these eligibility rule cases in a really big way, and the reason why we're seeing these 50-plus eligibility rule cases in a lot of respects is because of that Ohio decision. So I think that's another impact of it as well.
All right. No more thoughts. We'll get into our unilateral decision of the day. If you're designing the future model of college sports as it relates to movement, restrictions on transfers, what are you doing for the rest of eternity with the portal transfers?
I think Joe and Sam probably had a little bit more fodder on this one than I did. I think the idea is, do you work toward creating a model and a structure that creates predictability, or do you lean into the freedom that has been created through these cases? And I think that in talking, before the episode, a lot of what we have touched on through the episode is I think where you guys are headed with this in your decision about, the contracts that are already in place. But I want to hear you guys lay that out.
I think I've said it. I think the contracts are going to start to take care of this. I think you're going to see parameters. I think you're going to see buyouts. I think you're going to see, mechanisms in contracts that say, yeah, you can get out of this contract, but here's what we're going to have to get in return. And that's happening already. And I think as that becomes more prevalent and accepted, I think there's going to be a model that schools decide is good for them, but also good for the student athletes. And it should be like the student athletes still don't have to sign the deal. Like, yeah, this is good here, but if I have a conversation over here and they're willing to relent, like that's going to be something that can happen. But I think you're going to see some more uniform contracts,
which is fair. That's your prediction. But is that what you want to see? Is that what is the ideal scenario?
I mean, we've talked about what we'd like to see, and everything we've talked about on every episode is so interrelated right now. I go back to what I said a few episodes ago. Like, I'd love to get whoever's going to be in charge of the NCAA and the CFP and whatever else is going to be, the overseer of college sports, and then have this group over here decide what's in the best interest for the student athletes. Spend a year. Like, we know what all the issues are. We talk about them in every one of these episodes and on social media, everywhere else. We know what they are. Figure out what makes the most sense for each side. Take a year and then put everybody in a room and say, these are the things we need to agree on. And transfer eligibility is going to be one of those points of contention. Make that a part of the conversation and figure it out. I don't think we need to wait for Congress. I think we just need to have people that stop working on fighting every case that's coming their way and focusing their attention on what the future is going to look like in college sports.
All right, Sam, finish it off.
Yeah, so one thing that you said, Joe, that I really resonate with is the impact that transfers have on fan bases, because I'm a fan too. I don't like it when my favorite players leave my favorite team. It stinks. It's a really bad feeling. It's a bad feeling in the professionals as well. Like, plenty of instances where a professional player leaves my favorite team via free agency, and it's the same kind of feeling. And I do think the contracts are going to take care of a lot of this. In fact, it's kind of worth noting the contracts don't necessarily even just have to be like, if you leave, you have to pay this amount of money. You could also say, if you leave, if you're an Ohio State football player, we're going to have in your contract that if you leave for Alabama, it's going to cost you this amount. But if you leave for Michigan, it's going to, the damages are going to be significantly higher for us. So it's going to cost you this amount. Those are all things that are doable by individual contracts. Those are all things that are enforceable by individual contracts. Again, you can't have these blanket rules. That's what's not legal. I do think eventually, if and when we get to a position of collective bargaining, if and when we get to a position where maybe we do have a one-time transfer rule, like everyone, like so many people want us to go back to, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but I think there needs to be a legitimate way to have meaningful exemptions to that, where you have situations where there is flexibility for a guy like Noah Fenske, who is literally kicked off his team, to be able to transfer. There has to be, again, these meaningful exceptions. There has to be neutral arbitration to determine whether these are met. And I'll say the same thing when we get to talk about eligibility as well. It needs to be a neutral arbitrator. It needs to be someone where whoever this player association and the NCAA kind of mutually agree on. That's how it works in the pros, aside from the NFL, but that's a whole different conversation. A neutral person to be able to decide these things is kind of essential, and not someone who you're really, at the end of the day, represents the NCAA, who represents the schools.
No, that's huge too, because I mean that's where a lot of the issues have come. Like, once you give any leeway, is when there's arguments for all of the leeway. Mm-hmm. So when these guys get in a room and figure this out, unless they're agreeing that this is going to be the entity that approves this, and there's going to be an appeal process, I get it. But like, this neutral third party has to be agreed upon by both, because once you give one waiver, everybody's asking for all the waivers, which is
of course
what we've been dealing with for decades.
Yeah. And I think as long as you clearly lay out what the waivers are available for, where you do have waivers available for getting kicked off your team, or needing to get closer to an alien, to a sick grandmother. Like, as long as you have those exemptions, they need to actually be upheld. And at the end of the day, that's what led to Ohio. It really is.
Well,
I think that the contract talk, I want that to be true. I want it to be where this is going. I have such a hard time with the current administration of these contracts and the way that it's just not really true, I guess. I don't know the best way to put it, but like, we've got these rules in place through the settlement that we'll get to in another episode that says that they can't be pay for play. And yet, so you've got these contracts that are licensing agreements. And I understand the concept of licensing agreements. We've been talking about it for 5 years with NIL stuff. Like, it makes a lot of sense. There's a place for them. But you're trying to enforce these pay for play components with a licensing agreement that leads to a bunch of loopholes, that leads to a bunch of, like, yes, there's language in, the Duke contract, we're talking about Mensa, where sure, you can't enroll at another school, and Duke has the right to put that in the contract. That's a licensing agreement. But at the end of the day, that's not considered in what they're licensing. Like, that's not really the point. And so they're paying him for one thing, and they're telling him that he can't do these other things that are unrelated if you're being honest. But if we're also being honest, they're not paying him for licensing. So we got to figure that part of it out, and we've got to just like put the cards on the table before you can have a real discussion about what you're going to put in the contract. Because I don't know if from a court standpoint, I don't know where things would go, but I do feel it's unjust in a lot of ways for an athlete to sign an agreement that on paper says, we're not paying you to play football here. We're paying you for your NIL, but also as a term of this contract, you can't play football anywhere else. And I have a really hard time with that. And until we solve that, I think that's where the focus needs to be.
No, you're 100% right. You're not wrong at all, because we never got to the resolution of the Mensa case. We never got to whether the court is actually going to be willing to enforce this not pay for play contract that is trying to be enforced as a pay for play contract. And no, I completely agree with you. In order for the contracts to really work, and maybe a court just sees through all the noise on this and just says it's clearly pay for play, whatever you're calling it. We're going to lie to enforce the pay for play contract. That's clearly what it is. But we don't know that. We don't know that until we actually get to a judicial decision, which we didn't get to in DeMond Williams. We didn't get to in Mensa. So we'll see what happens. I do think as soon as we get to a judge decision that says, no, you can't enforce this, I think schools will finally start saying, no, these are pay for play.
I know I'm getting ahead, but will that change anything about the House settlement if they have to acknowledge that it's pay for play, as that was kind of part of the term?
Well, that's a really good question. Okay. I don't know if there's anything necessarily in the House settlement that forbids paying for play. I think it's something where schools are terrified that it'll lead to employment, but we're so past the Rubicon on employment anyway that why does it even matter?
Whether you view it all as challenges or opportunities, we got a lot of stuff to talk about over the next couple episodes. We've already mentioned the settlement. We'll talk about that next episode. But for this time, thanks for joining us on Unilateral Decisions.